Hello and welcome to everyone who is joining us this afternoon. I'm Ali Aslan, international TV presenter and journalist. And on behalf of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second edition of the Web Talk series, Pandemic Panic Politics, Democracy in Time of Crisis. Obviously, the coronavirus has been having an effect on people's life all across the world, and governments have been struggling to combat this virus and introduce new measures. And this series will look specifically at how various countries and regions are dealing with this crisis. Last week, as you may remember, we looked at Europe and at Spain and Poland in particular. And this week, we're going to the Middle East. Today, we will look at how Israel and the Palestinian territories have been dealing with the coronavirus. And I'm delighted to welcome a very high-ranked panel, three great experts to talk about this region and issue in alphabetical order. He is a member of the German Bundestag and the deputy chairman of the FDP parliamentary group. Alexander Graf von Lambsdorff is joining us. He's also known as one of the most prominent foreign policy experts and voices here in Germany and Europe. Delighted to welcome the executive director of the Palestinian Center for Research and Cultural Dialogue in Bethlehem, Dr. Walid Shomali. And last but certainly not least, it's my great pleasure to welcome Associate Professor of Ancient History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Professor Dr. Alexander Jacobson. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Lovely to have you. Lots to talk about within the next 60 minutes. Professor Jacobson, let's start with you. Coronavirus, as we've said, COVID-19 has affected all countries worldwide. It is a pandemic that has caused a great deal of disturbance across the globe. For those who are not too familiar with the situation in Israel, what's it like in Israel? How hard has the country been hit by this virus, and what measures has your government taken?
Well, the government adopted pretty strong measures. So if you compare it, I would say it's the opposite of Sweden, or maybe the opposite of Brazil in a way. So they took it very seriously, and they took strong measures very early, which really hurt the Israeli economy. The economic cost is going to be very high because they really gave precedence to public health, and they regarded, they adopted the more conservative attitude. That's to say, you shouldn't take risk, you should close, more or less close everything. They closed the economy for quite a substantial period. They imposed a lockdown, not immediately, but we spent a lot of time, under this lockdown, when you were only allowed to go out to buy some things, but basically people were prohibited from any contacts between households, okay, including one's parents and all that. And then they closed most of the economy, except for the most vital things. Now we are going out of it. Now we are on our way. They are relaxing every day. There are relaxations and there are arguments about what to open, but we are well on our way to bring things back. But for, I would say, more than a month, there was an extraordinary regime of virtual lockdown and end of contacts between families and between friends, and even within families if you don't look in the same apartment. So they took strong measures, and the medical results are considered to be pretty good. There is always an argument about who you should compare Israel with, but if Israel is usually compared with the European countries, then our mortality statistics is very low relatively. It is 200, I think, 65 today for a population of which is now more than 9 million people. So that is relatively very low. And there was some 25, I think, thousand people who got sick. Most of them were light cases. So we never approached this nightmare that people were afraid of, not only in Israel, everywhere, that you would have to decide whom to save, whom to treat. There would not be enough ventilators or not enough. We never approached any of that, but there were fears And now people are saying that this was too much panic about it. But I have heard that it has happened in other places. So at least the Ministry of Health officials say it is because we took those measures, despite their economic costs, that we have never approached this situation.
So pretty tough measures taken by the Israeli government, but the numbers, as you say, they indicate that at least in terms of the casualty numbers, that seems those measures have proven to be a success. We'll get into more detail, of course, and I'll come back to you in a little while to ask you how the public feels about and how the public felt and still feels about the restrictions they had to endure. But first, Dr. Shomali, I want to get an overview and a sense from you how the Palestinian leadership has been dealing with the coronavirus up until now.
There are some similarities between the Palestinian situation and the Israeli situation, but nevertheless, there are differences as well because, you know, the low preparedness on the part of the Palestinian Authority in combating such a pandemic. Actually, you know, at first, the Palestinian Authority was kind in a shock, you know. Then they were like flustered and blundering what to do. And the only solution and the prompt solution for them, because of this low preparedness, and they cannot afford of having, you know, high rate of mortality as other countries, and the lack of respirators, lack of, you know, medical supplies, given the fact, you know, every, you know, supply you need to have has to go through the Israeli channel. You know, we're, you know, interlinked, you know, with the Israelis a lot in terms of exporting and importing, you know, staples, so that or commodities. And that's why, you know, the only solution was, you know, I mean, to crack down on the public and to issue the presidential decree on the part of President Mahmoud Abbas. That was on the 5th of March, which was kind of renewed on the 22nd of March as he enacted the emergency law, which is based on the on the Palestinian basic law, number 43. And then in April, there was another decree on the 3rd of April on his part to extend, you know, the this lockdown.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing is, and also, you know, given the fact that Palestinian political divide between the West Bank and Gaza Strip has really played a role, because, you know, the Hamas authority in Gaza Strip wouldn't comply by what Mahmoud Abbas has issued or promulgated. That was a real problem, you know, in the Palestinian territories as in general. Also, there were some I would say two types of committees in order to deal with the situation. The first kind or type of committees were formed by each governor in each governorate in the West Bank, especially in the West Bank, in the 11 governorates in the West Bank. And there was another committee formed by Fatah faction. And it seemed to me that there was not enough or sufficient coordination between the two committees, which maybe kind of complicated the situation. But in general, things went well. And the other thing is that the Palestinian population, although what my colleague Jakobson has mentioned on the Israeli side, this happened on the Palestinian side, that, you know, the economy and especially the private capital has been affected a lot. And there has been, you know, kind of a freezing in terms of all walks of life in general. But it seems out of the findings of two polls by Awrad in Ramallah, one on the 30th of March, the other one was on the 3rd of April, that whether or not people were satisfied with the measures taken on the part of the Palestinian Authority. More than 80%, 82% actually, have expressed satisfaction in this regard. Okay, I don't know, I can elaborate more, or if you want.
We will, of course, talk about the political ramifications of those measurements, as well as the impact the virus has had on Israeli-Palestinian relations. But let me first bring in Alexander Graf Lambsdorff here. Mr. Lambsdorff, you heard about the measures taken by both the Israeli government as well as the Palestinian Authority. If you compare it with what we've been doing, what the German government has been doing, what would your assessment be? How would you evaluate the measures taken?
Well, I mean, it's not for me to evaluate the measures taken by the Palestinian Authority or the Israeli government, but what I can say, and it's quite remarkable, is that in international statistics, Israel is considered to be the #1 successful country in combating the spread of the virus, and Germany is #2. So we must be doing something right. I think these are quite unusual figures. Now, the second observation I'd like to make is what Dr. Shomali just said. My impression generally is that the satisfaction with what the PA does or does not do in the broader population, the West Bank, is not usually that high. But if you have a rate of 80% of the people being satisfied with the actions of the government in such a situation, I believe that's also a positive development. I recognize the difficulties, particularly on the Palestinian sides, given the situation in the West Bank and Gaza, the split, all the things Dr. Shomali just spoke about. But I want to come back to one thing that Dr. Jakobsen mentioned, and that is the criticism that the measures have been exaggerated. That's the discussion we have in Germany as well. It's the prevention paradoxon. So if you do enough and are successful and the virus stops spreading, you are then accused, of course, of doing too much. Should you, however, have done too little first, the virus would have spread and you would be accused of having done too little. So it is, as the prevention medical people say, there is no glory in prevention. And I think that is something that we in politics experience as liberals here in Germany. We have tried to be responsible and respectful of the measures, but at the same time to push for a respect of civil liberties, to push for a reasoning behind measures that limit our civil liberties. So it's been also a bit of a balancing act for the opposition. We are an opposition party here. But by and large, I say, when I look at the Palestinian territories, when I look at Israel, when I look at Germany, and compare our 3 territories to some other parts of the world, by and large, I think we are faring rather well. My biggest concern really in this situation is Gaza, because of the circumstances there. The preconditions for the virus to spread are, I think, nearly perfect for a virus, and that I think should give us pause.
I think by now we've given a wonderful, very comprehensive overview of what the situation is like in Israel and the Palestinian territories up until now to our audience, and this is my appeal to those audience members who are joining us right now and following this discussion. You can participate, you should participate. Please submit your questions to the speakers and we will include them as we go along. Professor Jakobsen, you already said that the Israeli government has imposed very harsh restrictions. Obviously, those also affect civil liberties. You talked about a lockdown, very hard to move around. You basically had to stay in, had to ask for permission to get out, or had to have a very good reason to leave your house. How's the Israeli public been feeling about these measures taken? Have you sensed any backlash against those restrictions?
Well, according to the polls, at least, there is a majority of the Israeli public in favor of every single one of the steps that were taken. Interestingly, when Israeli polls are published, they always give the overall number, and that they give you by Jews and Arabs, because they always want to know. And interestingly, in the poll that I have seen, on every single issue, the percentage of Arab citizens who approved the government policy is higher than of the Jews. So the Arab population, the Israeli Arab, I'm speaking about Israeli citizen now, was really very definite in its support of every single measure, including the most controversial one, which got into trouble with the Supreme Court. And that is the one that allowed the security service to track telephones, mobile telephones, in order to get the information for those who were confirmed as sick, to know whom they had met for 14 days before that. So that's the idea. So that was, of course, very important for the authorities to, in order then to tell all these people to be isolated. Okay, so for that they used the technical power of the Israeli security service, which is, of course, considerable. They gave it power to tap anyone's telephone who is confirmed sick, and to give this information. That was actually appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that this was only permissible for a very short period at the height of the danger. And now, once the danger is no longer as severe as it was, it has to be stopped, and it has to be regulated by primary legislation. So they did not say it's in principle wrong. They said it might be permissible, but with severe limitations, and this can only be legislated by the Knesset and not ordered by the government on the basis of its specific powers on security. Now, while the court was debating that and gave a very, I would say, very qualified and limited green light, in fact, it forced the government to change the avenue. The public, according to the poll that I saw, among the Jews, those who said they were fully convinced that it was the right decision to allow the security service to do that, it was 44% of the Jews, and then 28 said we are fairly convinced. Whereas among the Arabs, 56% say they were fully convinced, and then 20-something said they were fairly convinced. So the Arab population had no doubt about that, even much less than that. So 44% actually says, yeah, we're willing to have it, but we're not enthusiastic. Okay? Whereas the Arab public was very firm in it. And generally speaking, the latest poll says that both Jews and Arabs say that this experience has improved the relations between Jews and Arabs. Again, I'm speaking about Israel proper, within the green line, not the Palestinians or the territories. Because there was everywhere it was obvious that there was very active participation of Arab citizens in the Israeli health system. That is known. A lot of doctors, a lot of nurses, the percentage of Arabs in the hospitals. These people are celebrated everywhere. Everyone applauds to the medical people. And it's obvious that this is a war in which Arab citizens are really at the front line now, taking very active part. So I would say that in this, that was the positive aspect of the whole thing. The dilemma of giving additional powers to the security service is a real dilemma. In my view, the difference between Israel and European countries is that the security service already has wide powers without the corona. Of course, the Israeli security authorities, and in particular the security service, has much broader powers than a European, a normal European security authority. So I would say, in my view, it is when the security authorities are using those powers for security, then there is a danger of political abuse. Of course, you cannot avoid it, but you must keep an eye on them in order to not allow them to, because when the security may well be a real reason, but it could also work as a pretext, or the borderline between genuine security and other things is not always clear. Whereas when you give them those already existing powers, but you extend them to another field, civilian field, and this field is not politically problematic. It's not that you are dealing with a riot or a protest or a strike or some kind of a thing that has a political implication and perhaps a national security implication. but you're dealing with something which is apolitical, and nobody is, the corona has no constituency, okay? Nobody is saying you violate our rights. So in my personal view, this in itself is not so problematic, but the court took a very serious view of it. I would say more pedantic that if I would have written this decision, it would have been less pedantic, but they really said that using powers, using an agency that is meant to confront a security threat in order to deal with non-security affairs is something that can only be allowed under the most extreme circumstances and with very stringent limitations.
But by and large, if I understand you correctly, there's been widespread support amongst the Israeli public.
Yeah, although of course I must say that while you have those polls that say that most Israelis say that, in the liberal press, of course, among opposition journalists, they have talked about corona dictatorship and things like that. So there has been criticism. It has to be said that this crisis coincided also with a political crisis and a coalition crisis. And there was a time when the Knesset was shut down. But in fact, it was not shut down because of the corona. It was shut down. The parliament did not function for some time because of the coalition crisis. And that was set right by the Supreme Court. And I think the Supreme Court was right to interfere there. But it was really, in my view, a political abuse of power by the Speaker of the Knesset, who used his power to suspend sittings because it was not in the interest of the right wing. So that was wrong. Not a dictatorship, but that was an abuse of power that was set right by the court. And I don't think it had anything to do with the corona powers. And I don't think there was any danger of a corona dictatorship.
Dr. Shamali, you already alluded to the high approval numbers that the Palestinian leadership received for its handling, despite the lockdowns, despite declaring a state of emergency, despite the restrictions of civil liberties. People, by and large and overwhelmingly, if we follow the numbers that you put forth, were behind it. Were there any critical voices, any people who are questioning, are criticizing the lockdown, are criticizing the declaration of state of emergency on the Palestinian side?
Yes, there is. Before that, let me mention the fact that I did not mention in the beginning that, you know, the mortality rate, that we had only 2 persons died in Palestine of 554 cases, which is a real success, you know, in Palestine. This is one thing. The other thing, don't forget the fact that we have a freezing of parliamentary life as well. The Palestinian Legislation Council has not been there for a long time, and there has been kind of degradation in the parliamentary life since the political divide between Gaza and West Bank. That's why the president had to issue and promulgate the decrees in that regard, which really invoked or provoked some criticism on the part of the NGOs, civil society, and you know, some of the opposition parties and of the private capital. Okay, so this, of course, there has been some criticism, and really, in some aspects, I think they were right in their critique, because, you know, women were kind of jeopardized, were discriminated upon. Like when the lockdown was harsher on women, that, you know, it was looked upon women like, you know, they have to stay home as housewives, and, you know, they were more lax and for men, especially, you know, for people to go to work in Israel. You know, we have, you know, hundreds of thousands, more than 300,000 workers who work in Israel. And, you know, there were some kind of grumbling among the Palestinians that they had no other means of subsistence. And so the Palestinian Authority and Security security services were less harsh on men than women, for instance. The other thing, you know, there was no mention for those of special needs or, you know, the handicapped people. You know, they were kind of, I wouldn't say discriminated upon, but they were not taken into real consideration in this kind of crisis. So this is you know, the most kind of criticism that has been circulating around in the Palestinian Authority or the territories. The other thing is the general criticism, which is what we call the monopoly of the information. That, you know, the Palestinian Authority has kind of monopolized the information, or even the media, that, you know, any kind of information was kind of, you know, less effective than that, you know, given or issued by the Palestinian Authority, which was really kind of criticized. The other thing, the other criticism was that the credit went to the security services rather than the for the health services, or the health public sector, or the private sector. You know, well, I admit that
Right.
many people, or the majority of the Palestinians, were satisfied much more under Mohammed Shtayyeh's government than, you know, of preceding governments, you know, in terms of transparency. And the government organized, or the Shtayyeh's government organized almost morning and evening press conferences and press releases, you know, giving, you know, transparent information to the Palestinian public.
Right.
And what really impressed me, Mr. Aslan, that what impressed me, the alternating of the ministers. You know, each time they would bring a different minister to talk about, you know, the impact of the coronavirus on the function of his or her ministry, which was really good, you know.
Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, Professor Jacobsen has already alluded to the fact that this coronavirus crisis happened against the backdrop of an inner political crisis in Israel. You had 3 elections with no conclusive outcomes. The country was ruled by a caretaker government for over a year now. The Israeli Supreme Court has approved Netanyahu's unity government deal with ex-army chief Benny Gantz. Do you think that Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has politically benefited from the coronavirus crisis?
Well, you know, we shall see whether he will benefit from the economic ramifications of it. Up to now, most people say he's done a good job. Not, I would say, an overwhelming majority, but it's very politicized. Generally, people who support him will say he did a good job, and then those who don't support him will sometimes admit it and sometimes not. But I think that I think most Israeli public, even more than the slightly more than half that support him politically, accept that it was managed well on the level of taking care of the public health. But the economic results are only, you know, are only beginning. You know, many people already heard, but over the next months, we will see how the government will, people expect the government to somehow compensate. Or they say, we took a lot of damage, that was inevitable, that's okay, but now they look for the government to restore their economic health to its previous level. And obviously it will not be possible for everyone. And how the government will be able to manage it is a big question. So I'm not quite sure that in the long run, he will have benefited from it, although now he also shares responsibility with Mr. Gantz, so he's not alone.
Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, nevertheless, let me ask you, Prime Minister Netanyahu was quite embattled. Corruption charges, of course, have plagued him for a long time. As we said, 3 non-conclusive elections took place in Israel, it wasn't clear whether he is going to survive it. Do you think, as an astute observer of world politics, Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, do you think that politically speaking, Netanyahu has benefited from at least the distraction of this virus crisis?
Well, let me say one or two things. One, the government always takes center stage in such a crisis. And just as we have seen a surprising renaissance of Angela Merkel's support here in Germany, the prime minister, of course, benefits from the fact that he uses the levers of power to manage the crisis. People see him in action, his cabinet in action, etc. Number two, the fact that blue and white collapsed and Gantz joined a national unity that destroyed the unity of his side of the political competition, of course, was to the advantage of Benjamin Netanyahu. As a footnote, I might add, I'm quite happy that there's not a new Knesset election coming up, because I chair the German-Israeli Parliamentary Friendship Group here in Berlin, and I'm desperately waiting for a counterpart in the Knesset. And they were so busy finding a prime minister that they didn't get around to doing that. So I'm happy that finally there's some conclusiveness. And my final observation is that, of course, this is an election year in the United States. But it is remarkable, I mean, just how close Netanyahu and the US administration try to walk. If you look at the coalition treaty in Israel, Europe is only a footnote now. It is only seen through the prism of US-Israeli cooperation. And this will, of course, go at the expense of the Palestinians, but it might strengthen Netanyahu further with his conservative base. What the election here in the United States will yield, we do not know yet. But for the time being, I totally agree with Dr. Jakobsen. For the time being, I think he's got wind under his wings and is in no trouble except his legal troubles. But as long as he retains the status as prime minister, he does not have to appear in court, so he should be calm on that front as well.
And as in the case of Germany and Israel, if you do a good job, the incumbent politician, the incumbent head of state, yes, stands to benefit from such a crisis. We are already getting in questions from the audience, and Professor Jakobsen and Dr. Shomali. One question that keeps coming up and that is being asked by our audience members is, of course, how Israeli-Palestinian relations have been impacted by this COVID-19 crisis, because now, maybe for the first or the longest time, both sides have a common enemy, the coronavirus. So what impacts has the coronavirus had on Israeli-Palestinian relations? Dr. Shomali.
Well, actually, there have been some accusations on the part of the Palestinian Authority to Israel that they have, the Palestinian workers infiltrate, to Israel against the will and volition of the Palestinian Authority, and they get infected there and get back, given the fact that, the socialization culture is well spread in the Palestinian territories, and that's so that's why, they really kept saying, they accusing Israel for this, and then the other thing, saying like, we do not have, of course, enough supplies, and so the Palestinian Authority always claims, which is true to a large extent, that as I mentioned earlier, that everything has to go through the Israeli channel, and had they relaxed the situation, it would have been catastrophic, given the lack of all medical supplies and so forth. So it's.
But observers, if I may jump in here, observers have said that Israel has allowed entry of crucial medical equipment and health workers into the West Bank and Gaza. Is that not accurate? Dr. Shomali?
Well, to some extent, but you cannot. All countries were, feared of having shortage in medical supplies, and you cannot say, as the pandemic, breaks out, you can solve everything, and you can supply, any country, or just all of a sudden out of the blue. I mean, it's something cumulative. I'm talking about historically, that it was kind of dripping on the Palestinian society, on the Palestinian government. So I mean, you cannot solve it, all of a sudden when it breaks out, the pandemic. Okay, I mean, you're right in a way, or to some degree, there has been some kind of cooperation, because they have the same enemy, and if they are infected, we are infected, and it's vice versa. But I'm talking, in general, everything, they have the system, they have the upper hand, they determine everything for the Palestinian Authority, which is really something has negatively affected the situation. One more thing, I just wanted to mention also, that there were some in terms of criticism, there were some Palestinian youth, who were arrested by the Palestinian Authority under the pretext that they did not coordinate with the Palestinian Authority. But some observers say that because of political background, or opposition, they were, that the Palestinian authorities' position has been promoted or enhanced because of the corona, and it took advantage of the situation in order to increase or to tighten its grip on the population, the entire population.
So, Professor Jacobson, let me ask you the same question. I mean, now you have a common enemy. Obviously, the coronavirus does not discriminate, does not exempt any country, any religion, any ethnic society. Do you think that perhaps coordinated efforts on both sides have led or could have led to an improvement of relations, to opening up a new chapter in this conflict-ridden history between Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, as far as I understand, there has been, and there is still, some serious cooperation on the ground. And it's not just negative in the sense of allowing something, but active cooperation, including, of course, Palestinians treated in Israeli hospitals and Palestinian medical staff trained in Israel, and all kind of technical assistance. And if I understand correctly, that happens even with Gaza, with Hamas Authority in Gaza, which, of course, with whom relations are, of course, are much worse. So in that sense, there is some, there has been some positive development. It was even praised by international observers, by UN people, as an example of what is possible. I must say, unfortunately, in the Palestinian press, including the official press, there are always all kinds of conspiratorial accusations of the Zionist enemy infecting the Palestinian people. If we try to do that, we were singularly ineffective, as you just mentioned. The final result is very poor. Just, when we say that Israeli casualties are low, we compare again Israel with Europe. But of course, the Palestinian results are even, we're very glad to say there was no, it looked very frightening, but there has not been a real outbreak either in the West Bank or in Gaza, at least up to now. It could have been much worse. So I think things on the ground are, I would say, pretty reasonable, also with the usual rhetoric that accompanies everything. But whether this is any kind of an indication of a political improvement, that is a big question. And I'm afraid here that I'm not very optimistic. And I must say that my immediate reason for apprehension now is actually Netanyahu's plans to carry out annexation of parts of the West Bank. We don't know exactly what he will try to do, but obviously he intends to do something. And unfortunately, in my view, well, I oppose that. So in my view, very unfortunately, Gantz has not succeeded in getting a veto. In the coalition agreement, he has to be consulted, but he doesn't have a veto over that. The one who has a veto is the American administration. Mr. Trump has a veto, because under the coalition agreement, this can only be introduced, coordinated with the United States. So The American administration can veto that. But so there are some indications that the administration is telling Netanyahu, don't hurry. But whether they will really tell him, don't do that until the election, because there is at least a distinct possibility that Mr. Trump will not be there. We don't know, but there is a possibility. And I'm afraid, my fear is that Netanyahu will fear that he will get a less pro-Israeli or pro-Israeli right administration in the White House after the election. And he will try to carry out his intention. I don't know how much of it, but some of it, this summer. And then I'm not convinced that Mr. Trump will stop him, because Mr. Trump may use this. He's allowing Netanyahu to go ahead with it as a card in internal American politics. Not so much to get the Jewish vote. People are much mistaken. Most of the Jewish vote will go for the Democrats. The great majority of American Jews will vote for the Democrats, regardless of anything. But the conservative Christians who support not just Israel, but the Israeli right, many of them might vote Trump precisely because he allowed Netanyahu to go ahead with it. Now, if this happens, certainly there will not be any good atmosphere between Israel and the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian public, because this is, of course, a crucial political issue on which, of course, that cannot be compensated by technical cooperation. We don't just have cooperation on Corona. Everybody knows that we have cooperation on security on the ground, and this is even more sensitive. But I'm afraid that political conflict may get in the way of it this summer quite soon.
Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, we just heard from Dr. Jacobson and Dr. Shomali responding to the questions of many of our viewers, whether the coronavirus crisis has led or could lead to improved Israeli-Palestinian relations. Both seem to be rather pessimistic about that. Were you hopeful? I mean, if anything, if there's ever a silver lining in this crisis, it is the realization that we're all in this together and that this virus does not discriminate. Were you hopeful, as an esteemed foreign policy expert, that that COVID-19 could have led to an opening of a new chapter between Israelis and Palestinians?
Frankly, no. The reason is that certain dynamics don't go away because of a health crisis. Look at what's going on in Libya. Look at the regrouping of the IS in parts of Syria. Look at the tensions between China and Japan. I mean, there are certain conflicts that do not go away even in the face of a global health crisis. It's a matter of fact and an experience we've seen in the past. Yes, it is possible to pull together for a certain time to cooperate on public health matters. Israel and the Palestinian Authority have done so in the past. We've also seen cooperation of Israel, helping people fleeing from Syria. But the underlying political issues will not be changed by the virus, I'm afraid. So my rather direct answer to your question is unfortunately a no.
And let me pick up, again, the question goes to you, Mr. Lambsdorff, pick up on what Professor Jacobson said, that Netanyahu has announced an annexation of parts of the West Bank this summer, indeed overshadowing whatever coordinated efforts might take place right now in light of the coronavirus crisis. The Palestinian Authority, of course, has threatened to cancel all bilateral agreements. You're not just a member of the German parliament, but you used to be a member of the European Parliament as well. As my understanding that the EU is considering sanctions on Israel and will meet in Brussels this Friday to discuss this issue. How do you evaluate this process?
Well, I mean, 3 elections in a row with electoral promises being repeated 3 times over make these promises more serious. And we've heard even from Benny Gantz that he would be in favor of some of the annexation going on. And so we will have a situation that's going to be extremely difficult. In Europe, sanctions, I believe, are not going to come through. You need unanimity of all EU member states. And I, for one, would be very surprised if Germany would agree to it, just like Denmark or Bulgaria, the traditional friends of Israel here in the European Union. But many other countries will be livid. Let's be very clear about this. I'm also very worried about what Jordan's position will be, because, of course, seen from Amman, the annexation of the Jordan Valley, for example, would change the situation right on its border, not in a factual manner. Israel already controls it, but in a legal manner, and it would be a matter of political expediency for the Jordanian government to take a strong position on it. And given that they have a peace treaty with Israel, I fear for that treaty. If you see how differently Egypt and Jordan are behaving currently, I'm seriously concerned about the future reactions that come out of Amman.
Dr. Shomali, your response, your reaction?
Yeah, well, actually, things will be really complicated in the near future if, certain measures or steps will be taken by the Israeli government in terms of annexation. Let me give you an example. You talked, you and Dr. Jacobson about, the cooperation for the corona, which is true to some extent, as I told you. But, the Israeli government has been holding, the Palestinian tax money for a while, for a while, because they accuse the Palestinian Authority of, well, it's not like accusation, it is for true, that, to pay for the political Palestinian prisoners and the families of the martyrs. Under the pressure of the pandemic because of the general situation and because of this coronavirus, they have released, or promised, to release this money. I mean, why would they hold it for a long time and then just under the pressure of the general pandemic situation, they change and they, release the money? So this is something they always try to pressure the Palestinian Authority to withhold paying to those families. I mean, even if a certain prisoner or martyr, committed anything, in the eyes of the Israelis, why would his family, pay the price not to have any breadwinner? So this is something. And now with this annexation strategy, as all mentioned before me, it will be a real problem, and nobody knows what will happen in the Palestinian territory. I mean, people are boiling now. I mean, it's really kind of the political situation is becoming more volatile. I mean, given the economic situation on one side, the coronavirus on the other side, and the annexation and the Israeli measures on the other side, which is, I mean, something will. I think something will erupt, soon in the Palestinian territories.
So it's a perfect storm brewing, is what you're saying, Dr. Shomali. Professor Jacobson, do you share the same sentiment, the same pessimism that by and large tensions are building up, too many negative elements are coming together at once, leading to worsening of the situation?
Pardon, could you repeat the question?
I was saying, do you share Dr. Shomali's sentiment and fear? Yeah.
I'm afraid that, well, annexation can create a very bad situation on the ground. Now, we don't know exactly what kind of annexation Netanyahu will push for and how far the Americans will allow him to go. By the way, Gantz, if you read his statements, he is not really in favor of anything. He said he was in favor of annexing the Jordan Valley in coordination with the international community and after consultation with Jordan, which obviously means that you don't want to do it if you want to ask the Jordanians whether they are okay. So, but that was kind of a pre-election because Jordan Valley is considered to be a strategic territory, and so he didn't want to be against it. But in fact, I think what I'm afraid of is that Netanyahu may leave Jordan alone and prefer not to quarrel with the Jordanians. but he may go for annexing the settlements or some of the settlements, including the settlements over either in blocks or even those outside the blocks. There are a lot of them, so you can be flexible. But I think he will try to push for something. And I'm firmly opposed to anything of this. I think any kind of annexation would be hurtful to the idea of a two-state solution, which they, by the way, formally is back on the table, because under Trump's plan, he is talking about a two-state solution, but the conditions for the Palestinian state are, of course, very limited, and they include allowing Israel to keep all the settlements, including those that are in the depth of the territory of a future Palestinian state. That, of course, is making this state kind of I would say, kind of a pseudo-state more than a real state. So, I think that there is a real danger of a deterioration. I must say that we are now talking about Israeli annexation and about a Palestinian state on 70% of the West Bank, because this is what Trump is proposing. 70%. I'm sorry that the Palestinian side did not accept much better proposals that were on the table in 2000 and later, that would have given it virtually 100% and certainly more than 90% of the West Bank and Gaza, and the capital, and a real capital in East Jerusalem. In Camp David with Clinton, they were talking about a real Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Temple Mount, and not this caricature that Trump is proposing, that you take a neighborhood near a neighborhood and you call it Al-Quds, you call it Arab East Jerusalem. This is not real Palestinian capital in Jerusalem. There was a proposal for a genuine Palestinian state and a genuine Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. Unfortunately, it was turned down. Now we have a much worse situation, and we are arguing about not about Palestinian independence actually, but about Israeli annexation.
Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, as we are slowly running out of time, we have approximately 10 minutes left. We heard from both Dr. Shomali and Dr. Jakobsen, unfortunately, that the impact of the coronavirus on Israeli-Palestinian relations have not been positive, have not been conducive to opening up new positive and constructive chapters. What should Europe, what should Germany do here? How can Europe, how can Germany be a constructive element, if any, in order to prevent the worst case scenario from taking place come summer 2020?
Well, I think what we should be doing is to continue our kind of diplomacy. I mean, we are not as prominent a player as the United States. We've seen a shift in the foreign policy of the Middle East, of the foreign policy constellations in the Middle East over the last 10 years, also inside the Arab world. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates now much closer to Israel than they used to be. I think what we should do is to make it clear that Europe is an important partner for Israel and Palestine, that international law should be respected, and that unilateral actions, for example, annexations, are something that would really hurt our relationship, particularly with Israel in that case. I'm very unhappy about the situation as it seems to evolve. I'll be very frank about that. On the other hand, I think that patient talking to everyone is what we can do. Let's not forget, Europe is a very important market. I mean, our political clout is, as European Union, somewhat limited, but economically speaking, we're the biggest market that's close to both countries, and that both countries need really in order to thrive. So that's what I would say. It's not very original, it's not very innovative, but I think talking to Washington, talking to Amman, talking to Cairo, and insisting on the respect for international law, and also for what Professor Jakobsen just said, for a respectful interaction of the two sides is, I think, something that's very important. Continuing to try to be a constructive voice and player out there. Dr. Shomali and Dr. Jakobsen, we have 5 minutes left, so I would ask you to be brief in your remarks, because we're about to conclude and wrap up this discussion. Dr. Shomali, looking ahead now, you and Professor Jakobsen have spoken eloquently and extensively about the status quo of the situation right now and the impact the virus has had on your region.
Let's dare to look ahead. What do you think the next few weeks and months will bring? Some viewers are asking, for instance, do you think there might be a power change of the PA? Do you think that the situation in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, how will that be affected in the coming months and weeks due to the coronavirus? You have the word.
Well, actually, the Palestinian Authority lacks, in terms of the corona pandemic, it lacks a strategy, a future strategy in this regard. And unfortunately as well, that education and health is not, and in addition to agriculture, are not a top priority for the Palestinian Authority. If I tell you like 37% of the Palestinian budget goes to security services, which is, in favor of, it ends up in favor of the Israelis because of this security coordination that Dr. Jacobson mentioned, that really things will not improve unless there will be kind of reshuffling in the budget as well, and also on the Israeli side, they have if things remain as are, and their strategies to annexation, things will be complicated. No strategy on the Palestinian side to deal with the corona or for further pandemics or any kind of catastrophes, like earthquakes, for instance. We don't have any kind of future plans for that. And given the political situation, which is worsening political situation on the Israeli side, to be honest with you, the situation is very gloomy.
Right. Situation is gloomy, says Dr. Shomali. Professor Jacobson, looking at Israel again, as we said, after 3 non-conclusive elections and a caretaker government, the Supreme Court has now absolved and approved a unity deal, unity government between Netanyahu and Gantz. And as you said, the Netanyahu measurements and decisions taken in the coronavirus crisis have proven to be effective and successful as far as the numbers are concerned. How do you see the next steps?
Well, first of all, his legal troubles will be back now. The court system will resume it, among all the other things. The courts will function again, and he will stand trial on corruption charges. So I suspect that the proceedings may not be very helpful for him, although I don't know. Some of his supporters will support him come what may. But in any case, he is in trouble, and it's up to the court in the end to decide whether he's convicted or acquitted. So that's a very serious thing, and there is no way for him to prevent it. This coalition is problematic in many ways, but it means that there is no hope to try to prevent it by any kind of legislation. There were rumors that they were intending to do that, but they would have needed an absolute majority and a right-wing government fully committed to legislation and to a confrontation with the judicial system. This is not going to happen. He will have to stand trial and face the music of the justice system. So his lawyers will have to take care of that. So I think the rule of law and the judicial system are not in danger. The Israeli economy has been damaged, and there is a big question how quickly it will bounce back. Some people say it will be quicker than people imagine, because the high tech is very nimble and it can adapt very quickly. Well, let us see. I'm not sure. I hope they are right, though. But there is very considerable economic damage was caused because the government deliberately preferred to protect public health over economic considerations. I have to give them credit for that, but the economic and social cost is very difficult. And on the political field, I'm afraid that in the next months this annexation idea will cause trouble. This is very worrying. I think at this stage we should concentrate on 2 things: on protecting the feasibility of the 2-state solution. Not that you can have it tomorrow, but you have to preserve this as a viable option. And I'm afraid any kind of annexation is a blow to this hope. And of course, you have to try to make people's lives, everyday lives, as good or as tolerable as possible, even without a political solution. So on the latter point, I think Netanyahu's government is willing to work constructively. They don't mind that. But the right-wing ideological political aspirations may get in the way of it. And lastly, I must say that on the Palestinian security budget, it's very considerable, but I have a feeling that it is not only a result of security cooperation with Israel, which is important for Israel, of course, for preventing terrorist attacks, but it is also a result of the aspiration of the Fatah people in the West Bank not to see repeated in the West Bank what happened in Gaza. They don't want that, and on that there is common ground between the Israeli government and the Palestinians in Gaza, in Ramallah.
So very eventful and interesting, to say the least, interesting days ahead in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, this wraps up the second edition of the Web Talk series, Pandemic, Panic, Politics, Democracy in Times of Crisis, organized by the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom. This week, of course, we looked at the Israeli and Palestinian territories, and Professor Dr. Alexander Jacobson, Dr. Walid Shomali, and Alexander Graf Lambsdorff. Thank you so much for your valuable insights into the region, how the region has been dealing with the coronavirus, the political ramifications, and also the predictions, somewhat gloomy predictions for the future. Thank you so much for your input. And we will, of course, continue this Web Talk series. Next up will be, we're looking at Africa. Until then, thank you so much for your time, your attention, your input, for the many questions you have submitted and which we hopefully were able to include in today's discussion. So long, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.